Hello, I'm Tom Kennemer. This Hall of Heroes program is part of the Price of Freedom project by the Madison County Military Heritage Commission to inform and enlighten young people and the community as a whole about the sacrifices made by those in the military on battlefields around the world. We wish to thank the Huntsville School System and the ETV Broadcast Center for their help in presenting this Military Heritage program. And joining us today is U.S. Army veteran Larry Baer. Larry, it's a pleasure to have you with us today, sir.
Thank you, Tom. It's a pleasure being here.
Now, Larry is the recipient of the Distinguished Flying Cross, Soldier's Medal, Purple Heart, and the U.S. Army Commendation Medal with Valor. He was inducted into the Madison County Military Heritage Commission Hall of Heroes in 1992. Larry spent a total of 34 years in the military and retired as a lieutenant colonel in 1989. He is very active in local veterans affairs and presently sits on the board of directors for the Madison County Military Heritage Commission. And once again, appreciate you being with us. Thank you, Larry, for your time. Tell us, first of all, a little about your childhood. Where did you grow up?
Tom, I grew up in Grand Rapids, Michigan. My folks had a small gas station there, and I lived there until I was about 10 years old. Then they bought a store about 20 miles north of town on a chain of lakes. And I grew up in the country, going to country schools, went to a one-room country school in the winter, went to a small rural high school, hunted, fished, boated. Had a
You're a country boy.
I'm a country boy. Genuine country boy.
Did you have family in the military?
I had a brother-in-law who was really my only brother, and a cousin. And my brother-in-law was in the South Pacific. My cousin was a bomber crew member with B-24s over Italy. And that really, I grew up during that environment, and that really got my mindset toward the military, is these two gentlemen.
Now, you first got involved with the National Guard. Tell us about that experience.
I was in high school, and I was a senior in high school, and a group of us went down and joined the Michigan National Guard down in Grand Rapids, Michigan, which was about 20 miles from our high school. And I spent a total of 7 years in the National Guard. I started out as a private. I worked my way up to Sergeant First Class. Then I went to the Military Academy in Michigan. I got a commission as a second lieutenant in the infantry. So during the 7-year period, I went from private to second lieutenant.
What was your deciding factor, Larry, to go on active duty?
In 1961, the communists erected the Berlin Wall. To block the East German access to West German portion of the city. The Army was rapidly expanding during that period because they were going to have to, thought they were going to have to reinforce all of Europe against the Russians. I came on active duty in 1962. I was assigned to the 1st Infantry Division at Fort Riley. I spent a total of 4 months there. My commander asked me where my wife was, and I indicated that she was still with her family in Florida because they had mixed up my orders initially and sent me to Fort Benning. So I took my wife and family to Florida for a temporary time. And they said, well, you better keep your wife there because you're going to Germany. 2 months later, we were in Berlin. And I spent a total of 6 months in Berlin itself.
Tell us a little about, you saw the wall up close and personal. Explain, especially to students that may be studying about this sort of thing, what was it like? What did it look like?
Berlin was a 4-power city. It was a 4-power city after the war, just like Germany was a 4-power country. And on the Allied side, there was the French in the north, the British in the and then the American sector. On the east side was the Russian sector. There was supposed to be free access for the entire Berliners throughout the city. They put the wall up to block the free access. We started running intelligence patrols, if you will, into the eastern sector on a daily basis. The patrols were, you'd wear your green uniform in a military sedan, no weapons or anything like that, but we would maintain our free access, and we would spend our time in the city gathering intelligence on the movements of the Russian military in and out of the city because they were trying to reinforce the city as well. So we would watch Russian activities throughout the city.
Do you see a lot of people trying to escape from East Germany?
We had several attempts to escape. We ran several patrols while Senator Strom Thurmond was in the city.
Right.
We raised a lot of ruckus to get the Russians to start chasing us around one end of the town while Strom Thurmond was looking at other parts of the city. We did participate in 1 or 2 escapes.
Mm-hmm. And how long were you stationed there?
I was stationed there for 6 months.
I see. Now, when did you first go to Vietnam, and what was your job or mission on your first tour in Vietnam?
I went to Vietnam initially in 1964. I got orders in early 1964, and I went to Fort Bragg for an abbreviated special warfare program for advisors. From there, I went to Washington, D.C. for 3 months to study Vietnamese.
You were a first lieutenant at that time?
I was a first lieutenant at the time. I was promoted to captain just prior to going to Vietnam. I went to Vietnam 5 days before Christmas, leaving a pregnant wife and 3 children.
In 1964?
1964.
Right.
My initial assignment was I was an advisor to a Vietnamese infantry battalion at a little town called Cu Chi, about 25 miles northwest of Saigon.
Yeah. Kind of a jungle situation, or is it
the
like
environment in that area was rubber plantation and rice paddies. It was kind of the border zone between the two. South of us was huge rice paddies, and north of us was mostly rubber plantation.
Now, Larry, at that time, the North Vietnamese wasn't as active as the Viet Cong, right? Explain about that.
The North Vietnamese had not infiltrated into that area in any great numbers. We were operating against local Viet Cong forces. They may be running the cab service during the day. They may be the maids in the hotels at night. At night, they were operating out in the field as regular Viet Cong guerrillas. You didn't know who was a Viet Cong from who was a friendly force. And that kept you on the choice.
Tell us about, you've mentioned about this interesting story, and we've all read about it if you've studied Vietnam, about the tunnels in Vietnam. That is so interesting, and I'm sure the students or anyone watching would like to know about that. Explain about that, Larry.
The Viet Minh, going back to the French Indochina War, were very notorious for digging tunnels. And we knew in the area that I was in, there were tunnels. But we attributed most of them to local guerrilla forces that were operating. We would go out and we'd get shot at from spider holes, portions of the tunnels. But later that year, the latter part of 1965, the 25th Infantry Division came in from Hawaii, and they established a base camp just outside of Cu Chi. And what they didn't realize is they established this base camp right on top of a major Viet Cong tunnel complex, which was a city under the ground. It had weapons depots, it had a hospital, it had headquarters, it had ammunition supply, it had operations headquarters, all 2 or 3, 4 stories below ground. And
underneath them.
And they lived there the entire time the 25th Division was operating in that country. And they never got rid of them. If you go back today, it is a major tourist attraction.
What about the bombing, the American bombing? Did that destroy some of the tunnels? Have an effect on it?
Only superficially.
I see.
No.
Yeah.
The ground composition was almost like a clay, and a bomb would just do minimal amount of damage.
Larry, now, do you speak Vietnamese, or did you learn to speak Vietnamese before you went over?
I did. Tôi nói tiếng Việt lắm.
Recognize some of that.
I speak a little bit of Vietnamese.
But that was, and you would go out with the Vietnamese and explain exactly what your mission. What would you help them do?
Where we were located in Cu Chi, we were in a pacification program, and the idea was to pacify certain areas outside of the major cities and keep moving this pacification farther and farther out from the major cities. So our job was to go after the local force of Viet Cong, engage in small unit operations against the Viet Cong, and I lived with the Vietnamese 24/7. We slept in their same headquarters, we ate in their mess halls or on the ground. We did everything with the Vietnamese around the clock.
Tell them what you ate. I mean, you ate with them.
We ate with them. We ate rice, fish heads, fish, snake, lizard.
Delicacy, right?
Real delicacies.
Yeah.
Escargot.
Did that take some
And
getting
milk
used
bomb.
to? I mean, really, I mean, it's a little getting used to when you first started doing that, right?
Oh yeah, it took a long time to get settled into their routine and their way of diet. But my counterpart, if you will, the Vietnamese battalion commander, spoke a little bit of English, and between his English and my Vietnamese, we were able to communicate quite effectively.
Now, that was your job or mission, the first tour. You were, of course, 2 tours in Vietnam, but that was what you did in the first tour. Right?
That was what I did for about the first 8 months.
Okay.
The last 4 months, I was assigned to the 62nd 51st TAC Fighter Group, which was air commando operations in Vietnam. And I was a ground liaison officer with the air commandos, more or less advising them on ground operations that we'd been involved in. Mm-hmm. And I also got an opportunity to fly with them.
Right. Larry, what about free time? Say after a mission, what kind of relaxation what kind of relaxation did you have after you went out with the Vietnamese, South Vietnamese on a mission?
When I was working with the Vietnamese loved to play volleyball. Mm-hmm. So we'd always get a game of volleyball. It's American advisors against the Vietnamese. And we would play volleyball every day. Mm-hmm. We would also go into the local restaurants with our Vietnamese counterparts for the local cuisine, which was more fish, more chicken, more of the same,
more delicacies,
more
right.
delicacies.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, how many Americans were involved? You and how many more Americans were involved with these missions?
My team consisted of 4 people. Myself, I had a lieutenant, there was an assistant advisor, I had a weapons advisor, and I had a communications advisor, mm-hmm. two sergeants. And that was it. That was our entire team.
Did you lose anyone during this tour or this
Fortunately,
part of your tour?
no. Fortunately, we all went home.
I'm sure you formed lasting friendships, Larry, in the service. Do you still stay in contact with a lot of your friends?
I have a real good friend. In fact, he's right in the middle of this eye of the storm down in San Antonio, Texas, that I'm going to talk to here shortly. But gentleman and I were in Vietnam 2 tours together, mm-hmm. and wound up in Hawaii together. Mm-hmm. And then I belonged to the Mobile Riverine Force Association, group members from my second tour in Vietnam, and we stay in contact.
Mm-hmm. Now, let's talk about your second tour. Tell us about the mission for which you would later receive the Distinguished Flying Cross. That was on your second tour.
That was on my second tour.
Yeah. Tell us about that mission.
I was in a joint Army-Navy group in the Delta, and the units would operate in certain areas along the Mekong River. We would use naval ships to move up the canals. We would use helicopters to insert the units on the ground. When we would extract our units, we knew that the Viet Cong would come back into those units that we had just left, those areas we had just left, mm-hmm. to see if we had left any intelligence for them or anything that they could use against us. So we would conduct night operations against the Viet Cong. And the night operation consisted of a command and control helicopter, which I flew in, as well as 2 UH-1 Cobra gunships. And we would fly low over the canals to try to locate Viet Cong activity. Because they moved like we did, they moved on sampans across the canals too. This one particular night, we got hit by a fuselage of fire from one of the sites that we had just been in. The helicopter was hit, one of my assistants was wounded, and we returned fire and was able to neutralize the enemy on the ground for a short period of time so we could at least get out of the line of fire. And we were able to direct the Cobras that were flying above us to clean out the Viet Cong activity that was along the shore bank. Mm-hmm. What wasn't in the citation was the helicopter crashed eventually. And we flew from where the crash site was back to a friendly base riding on the pylons of a Cobra helicopter, which was interesting.
Yeah. But you weren't wounded.
I was not
in
wounded.
that particular mission.
I wasn't wounded.
Right. Now, you mentioned this was your second tour. And your first tour started in '64. When was the second tour? It was like '68?
'68. The second tour was November '68 to October '69.
I see. Now, what did you, in between your missions in Vietnam, did you go back to Germany, or where were you stationed at that time?
I was, when I came back after my first tour, I was stationed at Fort Lee, Virginia, and I was fortunate enough to be able to organize the first quartermaster officer candidate program since World War II, and I was able to command that for 6 months. Then I moved up to the staff. From there, I went to Fort Benning, went to the infantry career course, was promoted to major, and then went back to Vietnam as a battalion executive officer in this infantry battalion.
Yeah. Larry, you are the recipient of our nation's highest award for non-combat heroism, the Soldier's Medal. Tell us about the action for which you would receive this award.
Okay. The ship that we were on, the USS Benoit, had a large pontoon attached to the ship. And the pontoon served as the ammunition storage for the infantry units located on the ship.
This was in '68.
This was in '68.
Yes, sir.
So we didn't have to bring ammunition aboard the ship. We were having a social hour on the ship when a Vietnamese tugboat was hit by rockets about a mile north of us. The ship went to general quarters. I and several other Army types, along with the Navy, got on one of the troop transports, which has 20 millimeters and 50 calibers weaponry, and went up to where the tugboat was floating in the river on fire, burning. We were able to board the tugboat, rescue some of the crew, and start putting out the fire. There was 55-gallon drums of gasoline at the back end of this thing that was dangerously close to exploding. We were able to push the 55-gallon drums over the side, and an Army tugboat came alongside this Vietnamese tugboat and finally had enough water to put the fire out. I received the Soldier's Medal for the rescue of the Vietnamese crewmen.
Were you injured in any way?
I also received the Purple Heart.
I see, for your injuries.
For burns.
Were you burned?
I was burned and I had some shrapnel. Some of the stuff was exploding.
Yeah. Larry, you were also a recipient of the Army Commendation Medal with Valor. Explain about that award.
That took place during my first tour.
I see.
In June 16th, 1965, the North Vietnamese attacked a Special Forces camp at a village called Dong Xuai, which was in the rubber plantation. It was outside of a Michelin rubber plantation. During the first initial insertions, the Viet Minh, or the Viet Cong, MDA, had pretty much outlined where all of the possible landing sites were. So 2 ARVN battalions landed in landing zones and were pretty much wiped out on the ground. My battalion and a Ranger battalion finally was inserted, and we landed right on top of the base where they were, because we figured they wouldn't expect us there. So after about 2 or 3 days of firefights, things settled down, and we were directed to go out into the jungle and try to locate one of the downed helicopters and retrieve the bodies of the American and the Vietnamese crew. And that's where I received the ARCOM with Valor.
How would you describe to young people what it's like to serve in war, the thoughts you have of possibly being killed or wounded in battle?
I grew up a very devout Catholic, and I realized that life is precious, and my life is precious, but I was willing to put my faith in my military training, the cause we were fighting for, and the people that I was leading and fighting with, all good people. And I really didn't focus on the possibility that I'd get killed or wounded. And I think if you do, that is going to affect your ability to fight. But if you have faith in yourself and you have faith in your training, you get through that.
Larry, is it okay to be afraid and scared during
Absolutely.
combat? Yeah.
Absolutely. I think fear heightens your sense awareness. It heightens your reaction time. And I was gosh awful scared a number of times. But I think fear also keeps you alive.
Training kicks in too as
The
well.
training kicks in.
Yeah, yeah.
The good training that you receive kicks in.
Yeah. Share with us who or what prepared you to take the actions you did during the Vietnamese or during combat.
The training I received, primarily. Like I said, I was an infantry officer, so I was trained in infantry tactics from the time I was a lieutenant through the time I was a major. I was trained in the weaponry that we were going to be using, which was primarily World War II style weapons. I was put in with a very good Vietnamese unit. I trusted my Vietnamese counterpart. He trusted me. We had a wonderful working relationship. I would travel with him any place without fear of compromise or anything. My second tour, the same thing. I was with a wonderful group of guys in the Delta, both Army and Navy personnel that I worked with, and that brings you through. If you got confidence in the people you're dealing with, and you got confidence in your own training, that gets you through.
Kind of tough to get along with those Navy guys, though, sometime, right, Larry?
They speak a different language.
Larry, do you often wonder, would you do it all over again?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I was at a function last Sunday at the Veterans Museum, and it was a group of Vietnam veterans. And I think to a man, we all agreed that it was a hell of an experience, but we would do it over again.
Mm-hmm. There were protests back home during the Vietnam War. What was your feelings on that, and did you encounter any protests upon your return?
Tom, I was very fortunate that I stayed in service. Mm-hmm. And as such, I was pretty well insulated by living on Army bases. Mm-hmm. And where I was stationed initially was in Hawaii. Hawaii is a very pro-military state. Other than tourism, the military is the economy of Hawaii. There were protests. The protests made it to the outside of the gate of Schofield Barracks and other barracks, but they weren't very effective. And I never was personally challenged by any protester. Mm-hmm. So I was very fortunate in that regard.
Larry, you mentioned earlier that in between your tours in Vietnam, you served at Fort Lee and your activity there. Talk about some of the other places that you served following your service in Vietnam. You stayed in 34 years.
I stayed in 34 years. Upon my second tour in Vietnam, I was with the 25th Infantry Division for 3 years at Schofield Barracks, Hawaii. Mm-hmm. I worked on and received my bachelor's and master's degree while I was there. My follow-on assignment to that was at Tulane University, where I was an Army ROTC instructor for 3 years. After we left there, I went to Fort Leavenworth, which is the Army Command and General Staff College, as a student for a year. Following that assignment, my wife was able to stay right on base, and I went to Korea, where I was assigned to the United Nations Command. I was a duty officer and special operations officer at the United Nations Command in Seoul for a year. Mm-hmm. Went back to Leavenworth, where I was an instructor for 3 years. You go from a student 1 year to being an instructor the next year. Yeah. I stayed there for 3 years. I went from there to Fort McClellan, down the road here, where I was the IG. Made me fall in love with Alabama. Yeah. And also during that period, I had 2 children. One married a local boy from Leavenworth, one married a girl from Arab.
Really? Okay.
And the third boy was engaged to a girl from Huntsville.
Really?
So my roots were slowly sinking into Huntsville in Alabama.
Yeah.
From Fort McClellan, we went to Germany for 3 years, where I was in the 7th Corps headquarters. Coming out of Germany, I told the Army, I said, if you send me to Redstone Arsenal, I said, you won't have to move me again. Right. So they said, okay. So I wound up as a battalion commander out here at Redstone Arsenal for my last assignment.
And that's where you retired?
That's where I retired.
those who have served in the armed forces for any length of time are aware of the extended military family, and I know you are. Tell us about what that meant to you and your family when you were serving overseas and your family couldn't be with you.
Tom, that was tough because at that period we didn't have the wonderful social programs that they have for the young Army and young military wife.
Right.
Both tours, I brought my wife back to Fort Myers, Florida, where her parents lived, and my parents wintered. So at least she was close to family. But they did not have the support groups in the military as they do now. Mm-hmm. And it made it difficult. And it's harder on the wife and family because I know what I'm involved in. Mm-hmm. She doesn't. You know, she thinks I'm in mortal danger every day. And that weighs very heavy on the families.
I've had the veterans tell me during these interviews that the wives stick together too, and they
do
help each other and pitch in, and
and it's much more so now because there's more organization involved in it.
Exactly.
Yes.
You served nearly 35 years in some capacity in the military. You've served in peacetime and in combat. Is there a time in that period that stands out in your memory?
I think my tour with the 25th Division in Hawaii was probably the best tour we had. The war was over. Vietnam was winding down. We knew we probably were not going back to Vietnam again. This was my second tour. Mm-hmm. I had spent 3.5 years without my family. I look forward to the peacetime Army, and although we were in a peacetime Army, we trained hard. But we also relaxed. I learned how to scuba dive. Got my college out of the way. It was a great assignment in a very delightful state.
And in paradise, so
paradise.
To speak. Yeah, in Hawaii, right.
We still go back.
Yeah, good. Larry, tell us about your family. I believe you and your wife, Rosemary, have been married, 60 years now?
60 years. Yeah. We celebrated our 60th anniversary this past June. I met my wife in the 6th grade. We were grade school friends together.
Childhood sweethearts.
Childhood sweethearts.
Right.
By the 8th grade, I thought she was a knockout. From the 8th grade through my freshman year of college, we were pen pals. Mm-hmm. She lived in Florida, I lived in Michigan, and we just communicated by letter. My freshman year of college, during spring break, I went down to Fort Myers, and the first time I'd seen her in 5 years, and I fell hell over heels in love with her. Before I left to come back home, I asked her to marry me. Yeah. And we were married in 1957. We have 3 wonderful sons and 2 wonderful daughters and 10 grandchildren and 2 great-granddaughters. Mm-hmm.
A lot of them still in this area. I mean,
our 3 children. Sons are in this area.
I see.
One son lives in Arab, and the other 2 sons live here in Huntsville. Our youngest daughter is a speech technician with the VA hospital in Maine, and our oldest daughter lives in Charlotte.
Mm-hmm. What was it about the Huntsville area? You touched on it a little bit now because, family. Tell us about what is it about the Huntsville area that made you and Rosemary want to settle here after you retired?
When we came back, we were assigned to Redstone Arsenal.
Right.
And we realized that this is a fantastic city. It's a charming city. It's not a terribly large city, but there is so much to do in this area. Mm-hmm. The climate is wonderful. The terrain is beautiful. The mountains, the hills, and being a country boy, we live out in the country.
Right.
We just fell in love with it. It's a wonderful place to live. Mm-hmm. About all you can say. It's a charming city.
A lot of retired military, too.
A lot of retired military here.
A lot of your friends and so forth. Now, you sure, obviously, I want the audience to know about this. You have stayed busy during your retirement. I mentioned you're on the board of directors for the Military Heritage Commission, right. But you're also involved in other projects as well. Tell us about some of them.
I have been with the U.S. Veterans Memorial Museum since before it opened. Right. It was an empty warehouse that we populated. I am the director of exhibits. I'm the one that's designed, and I and a retired sergeant major built most of the exhibit cases and populated most of the exhibits. Mm-hmm. I've been involved with them. I am involved for the last 9 years with Wreaths for Veterans, where we decorate the veterans' graves at Christmas time with Christmas wreaths, and then conduct a memorial service for the veterans that have fallen. I'm involved in chapel operations out on the Arsenal. I'm a plank holder with the Mobile Riverine Force Association, which is the group of Army Navy retired, and we meet every other year. And I'm involved with the Air Commando Association down at Eglin Air Force Base.
If it's a veteran event, Larry is going to be involved in it, I can just about assure you. But we appreciate that very much, Larry. What advice would you give to young people who may be considering a career in the military?
Tom, I've got two grandsons that are sergeants in the Alabama National Guard. Mm-hmm. One grandson is deployed to Guantanamo, Cuba, guarding detainees. The other grandson is getting a position with the Army Ranger School down at Fort Benning as a National Guard instructor for the Ranger School. What I would tell young people, and I told them pretty much the same thing, if you are looking for a life of service, a life that has a lot of rewards in it, a life where you can dedicate yourself to preserving our freedoms, really being involved in your job, not necessarily as a job, but as a way of life, mm-hmm. then the military is a good option for you to pursue.
Mm-hmm. What would you like for young people, especially our students, to learn and hopefully remember from your military experience?
My experience is pretty much indicative of my generation of military. The wars that we fought, the assignments that we had. The wars that they're fighting today is a little bit different. But we didn't do anything out of the ordinary other than what our nation asked us to do. I think, as you indicated earlier, would you do it all over again? Most of us would agree that we would have done it all over again. And we're very proud of the fact that we served and were able to serve.
I think most veterans have said the same thing, Larry. They would do it all over again, and some tough times, that they went through. I want to thank you for participating in our oral history series and allowing us to preserve your military experience for the people of this community. And thank you, Larry, for your service to our country.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you for your service.
Thank you, sir. And also I'd like to mention that if you'd like more information regarding this interview or any interview in our Military Heritage Series, please contact the Madison County Military Heritage Commission website at mcmhc.org. Thank you for joining us.